For decades, America has tried to combat the harms of drug use primarily through banning drugs and incarcerating people who use them. But this has caused a violent underground market for drugs, increasing crime in our communities. It's caused contaminated substances, increasing overdose deaths, and it's caused incarceration to skyrocket, destabilizing families. What we're doing isn't working. Crime, death, and broken families are the collateral damage of using the criminal justice system to address the public health issue of drugs. If you're looking for a better path forward, you're in the right place. What if we changed our drug policies to prioritize life, health, harm reduction, and thriving? And what if it benefited all of us? Our criminal justice approach to drugs had a beginning, and it can have an end. Join us on the journey to end it for good. I'm Christina Dent, your host, and if you're new here, End It For Good is a nonprofit started in 2019, based in Mississippi, that invites people to support approaches to drugs that prioritize life and the opportunity to thrive. This podcast is one of the ways we do that. You can head over to episode 34 to hear my story as a conservative Christian foster mom, changing my own mind on the best path forward with drugs, and then come on back and dive in deeper. I didn't change my mind overnight, and most other people don't either. We all need time to learn, think, ask questions, and explore. Whatever your perspective is, I'm glad you're here. Let's journey together. Welcome back to the End It For Good podcast. I'm Christina Dent, your host, here today with my friend Terry Blevins, who you might remember from episode 33. He came and shared his story, and I'll tell you a little bit about why he is suddenly back on the podcast again. But before I do that, let me just go ahead and remind you to hit subscribe so you'll get all of the great episodes that we've got coming your way. Even if you don't listen to them all, that's okay. But you want to have them on your podcast player so that you can kind of flip through the content and see what is it that is interesting to you to listen to on your next commute. And so I'm going to dive in with Terry because this is a really interesting conversation. We are talking about 7-OH, which is, if you've been on our newsletter list, you've gotten a couple of newsletters about it. You've seen some responses from newsletter readers about it. You've seen our perspective on it. Terry's going to tell us a little more about it. But when I sent that first newsletter on this new drug, I say new because it's just been on the market in the US for a short period of time. I got a text from Terry, and I hadn't talked to him in a long time. And he said, "Hey, Christina, I just read your newsletter on 7-OH, and I use it." And so I was like, "Oh my goodness, I've got to have you back on. We got to talk about this because you're doing advocacy work around it now." And so welcome to the show, Terry. We're glad to have you back.
Thank you, Christina. I appreciate you having me on again. It's great to see you.
Yeah, and I'm going to let you tell your story just to give people kind of the high level. You are a former law enforcement officer. You are the law enforcement advisor for Seven Hope Alliance. You're a national security expert and a speaker for the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, great friends of ours, on the moving towards a better, smarter, more effective approach to drugs, addiction, criminal justice, all sorts of things. And so I'm going to just let you tell more about your story instead of reading it off of your bio, because that way we can hear it in your words, and then we'll dive into 7-OH. But tell us, how did you get involved in this issue of drugs and substance use and how we approach those via the law? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to tell my story. I became a police officer at a really young age, at the age of 21, and when I applied for the department, I had to sign a paper that said that I hadn't used cannabis. I don't remember the exact amount of time, but it was within several years of my application. And I had used a little bit of marijuana in high school. So I thought, well, that's kind of weird. I didn't see a problem with marijuana, when I was in high school. I didn't see it causing a lot of issues or whatever. So when they made me sign that, and then I had friends who had used a little bit of other drugs, and they couldn't qualify at all because they had ever used any of these other drugs. And it just seemed excessive to me. It didn't make any sense. I mean, it was canceling out really good people that I knew would be good cops. And so that was my first sort of taste of the illogical view that our society and especially law enforcement had on any of these substances, and especially cannabis. And then once I became a cop, I just saw the obsession that law enforcement had with marijuana, and I never understood it. It didn't make any sense to me how there was such an effort put into going after people who even had the slightest amount, who used even the smallest amount, and a lot of people who used it for medicinal purposes. And so, and then I saw, as my law enforcement career progressed, I saw that we were wasting a lot of resources on cannabis enforcement. We were putting hundreds of millions of dollars into highway interdiction, and also into eradication in the mountains and even just looking for people that had a couple of plants in their backyard. We would call out the SWAT team, and the federal government giving tons of cash to departments who would focus on these issues. And as a detective and having worked on sex crimes, I saw that we had a lot of other problems. We had a lot of violent criminals that were out on the streets that we weren't even looking for. We had when I found out that we had tens of thousands of untested rape kits on police evidence shelves across the nation that we weren't testing because we didn't have the money, but yet we were willing to invest all that money into marijuana enforcement. It made no sense to me whatsoever. And I just started to understand better and better that this was really pointless. And then realizing that it was a Schedule I drug, which supposedly has no medicinal use whatsoever, I realized that was a lie. That was an outright lie, because I knew people that were using cannabis for medicinal purposes. And
even as a police officer, you saw that.
yeah, absolutely. And so just the lack of common sense sort of drug laws that were in place, I saw that really, really early on, and it disturbed me, and it made me realize that a lot of, in like one of the last agency that I worked for, they were getting more money in federal grants than they were from the taxpayers. So if you don't think that perverts an agency's alliance to doing the right thing in their communities, that's a perfect example of it, because they were getting all of this money because we were in a county that was sort of strategically located here in Arizona, a lot of through highways, and they had a huge interdiction team, and this interdiction team was just going out and stopping anything that moved on the highways and violating people's rights. And because I spoke Spanish, they would ask me to interview the Spanish speakers a lot. And I saw so many situations that just broke my heart, things that people that were persecuted because of these efforts, and then all of these other things that were going unnoticed. And so then late in my law enforcement career, I really started to speak out against the unnecessary cannabis enforcement, and the fact that we were putting all of this money into it and not funneling that money towards things that really mattered. I felt really mattered to the community, really mattered to the citizens. And it made me realize that law enforcement in a lot of ways was really out of touch with what our communities wanted. And George Floyd was really a tragedy, and it brought a lot of people's attention to the fact that law enforcement wasn't necessarily focused on what the communities wanted. And I had started talking about that back in the mid 2000s, and I thought I was kind of a lone voice in that aspect because I made a lot of enemies in law enforcement. And I, even at one point, my sheriff called me in and he said, Terry, you got to stop talking about this marijuana thing because you're really alienating a lot of your colleagues. And I said, well, Sheriff, I said, it's something that I feel strongly about. It's on my conscience. I said, I feel like that he said, well, I understand that, but you're going to ruin your career. And so I eventually, it was one of the reasons I ended up getting out of law enforcement was because I really felt that I tried to change law enforcement from within, and I may have made small impacts, but I didn't really make the impact that I felt I would like to have. And so once I got out of law enforcement, I really started looking for like-minded people, and that's when I found LEAP, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and at the time it was Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And right after I joined them as a speaker, they ended up changing the name to Law Enforcement Action Partnership, really to broaden the focus and the scope of the issues that they were working on, to not just be about prohibition of marijuana and prohibition of drugs, but to also have deal with harm reduction and policing reform and criminal justice reform in general. And they really educated me about a lot of these issues. And ultimately, I became a board member. I was a board member for 6 years, which was a huge honor. I loved working with that organization. It's a great organization and has had so much positive impact. And it really is the only organization of its kind in the sense that they are sort of a resource organization for other nonprofits and other organizations that deal with these issues, because you can just contact LEAP and say, do you have a law enforcement expert on this topic or in this geographic region? And we have hundreds of excellent speakers, and talking about George Floyd, prior to George Floyd, I tried to get some of my friends to join because they were kind of like-minded. They were starting to see the same things, and they were like, yeah, I would just ruin my career if I joined LEAP. But then after George Floyd, it seemed like people law enforcement started to change their minds, and they started to see that the public was kind of fed up. And so ultimately we had a huge surge in membership right after that. But I worked on cannabis for quite a few years. I advocated for legalization and for just common sense drug laws that had to do with cannabis, and saw how many things were happening that were illogical, how many law enforcement agencies that were still just digging their heels in on the whole cannabis issue, and how many politicians were digging their heels in on it when there was really no reason to. And so I was really, really fortunate to be able to work on that. And I got, like I said, I got an education from LEAP, started understanding how we change these things, how we can actually work on legislation, we can work with legislators. And that's another thing that LEAP does, is we provide law enforcement experts to meet with legislators, lawmakers, and even regulators, and show them how they've been fed this, spoon-fed this lie in a lot of ways, and the ones that want to listen and that really care about the truth are open to listening, to what we have to say, because we can tell them, we come at it from a completely different perspective. We're not beholden to the federal dollar, so
Yeah.
we're going to tell you the truth about it.
So I want to pause here because I want
Sure.
to highlight a couple of things that you said before we get into 70H. One was just how much violent crime there is that is not being investigated or solved but we are spending lots of resources on proactively going to find people who happen to be in possession of a drug. So we've got, thousands and thousands of rape kits that have not been tested, but we're testing for what's in this powder that somebody found in a car or something like that. So that's one point, because I don't think most people realize just how many violent crimes there never is an arrest made in it. It's different for obviously every, crime. Murder has a different rate than rape does, or assault, or whatever. But nationally, it's about 50%. 50%, if you just average out violent crimes, you are far more likely to get away with a carjacking than you are to get caught for a carjacking. You are far more likely to get away with just, kind of petty theft than you are to
Yes.
actually get caught for that. And yet, we're proactively finding people who haven't harmed anyone else yet, but maybe they're just in possession of a drug that we've decided we don't want them using. So I think that's one point. People just sit with that for a minute. If you are one of those victims who has been assaulted, raped, you've lost a loved one to murder, we are spending resources in other areas. And part of that is because of what you said. Another thing I learned that I did not know previously, which is there's lots of federal money that comes for different types of policing. So you can get grants for your police department specifically for drug policing. That are not available if you are working on, whatever, testing rape kits or prosecuting for rape or looking for people who are, committing murder, that sort of thing. So that's important. It incentivizes a certain type of policing, what we offer money for. And when you're getting more money to do that kind of policing than you're getting from your local taxpayers, like you said, from a local community, it incentivizes you to be moving towards that type of policing. Even if you feel like, maybe what might actually provide a better service to the community is something different. All of us tend to be beholden to where the money is coming from that is paying for our paychecks. So that's important. Another thing I wanted to highlight is the moral conflict that you felt over what I'm being asked to do. I do not think is helpful, and I actually feel like it's wrong. There is some of this that is just, I am participating in something that is harmful. That's another thing I think is really important for us to think about when we task someone with the type of job that law enforcement is, which is you get orders and you carry them out. It's like military. It's a top down. You don't, this is not, you decide what you kind of want to do and whatever. When we're tasking people and saying, we are telling you to go enforce this, we're giving you a gun, we are giving you orders, and you're going to go and do the things we tell you to do, we better be really sure that those things are not actually harming public safety, harming the community. Because if they are, we are asking officers to bear that moral weight of participating in something that they do not believe is right. And that's a really, really significant thing that we're asking people to do. And that's, I've heard from so many officers how difficult that is if they go through a sort of mind change like you have, to look back on other parts of their career and say, on the one hand, I can say, yes, I was following orders. I was doing what I was told to do and what I committed to do when I signed up. On the other hand, I feel a great deal of conflict and guilt over maybe some of the things that I participated in that maybe I was ordered to do, but just because you're ordered to do it doesn't mean that you feel right about doing it. And that's something we cannot say, well, that's on them. That's on the officers. No, it's on us, the people, what we're asking them to do. It is on us, what we are saying, you've got to go home and live with this. You're the one who we sent out there to do our bidding, but we don't feel that weight because we didn't go with you on that call. We didn't arrest that person. We didn't see that mother crying. That's what you had to bear. And that's an important, and I as somebody who is very thankful for law enforcement, feel very strongly that we should be very careful the kind of weight we ask them to bear, because they're already bearing significant weight from a very dangerous job. It is wrong to ask them to bear weight for things they feel morally or conscience conflicted over.
Well, and ultimately, you described it so well. And if you take the words that you said and analyze those, you have to believe that ultimately affects the type of law enforcement officer that, or the type of person that is attracted to law enforcement, and the type of person who can be retained. We have a huge shortage of law enforcement officers all across the country right now. And I firmly believe it's because law enforcement lost its way and really was focused on the wrong things. And the younger generation coming up, they're just not interested in that type of law enforcement anymore, most of them. I feel like that in some ways, younger generation has more of a conscience than my generation did. And just to go back to what you were saying about violent crime, just to put a bow on that. At the time that I was working as a supervisor in law enforcement, I saw that we had a list of thousands of arrest warrants for violent criminals that nobody was doing anything about. And I said, well, wait a minute, why are we so focused on highway interdiction and on eradication when we don't, when we have, and what I found out was one of the guys that I talked to about it, he said, if you go out with this list, he said, you'll see that most of these people are living at the house, the address that we have for them, and we haven't even gone to look for them. And so I found out that the reason that we weren't focused on that is because there was no federal money in it. All the federal money was in highway interdiction and in eradication and local drug enforcement. And so to me, that it just completely and I felt that it attracted a type of person that they wanted because a lot of these drug task forces, they get to wear plain clothes and they get to drive around these cars that they've seized from the bad guys, these cool cars, Camaros and Corvettes and stuff. And they get to put on their vests and bust down doors and everything, And I mean, there's a need for that, but it gets to be too much. And when that really is the focus of your entire department, and the department that I worked for, man, that was really a focus. And the thing is, if you were in patrol and you wanted to be considered for this cool drug task force, you would focus most of your day on going out and actually getting drug arrests. We're talking about the uniformed patrol people. Instead of patrolling or doing things that that really mattered to the community, they were out pulling cars over and searching people's vehicles so that they could prove to the drug task force, you should bring me on so I get to dress in plain clothes and drive cool cars. And man, that law enforcement agency just completely lost its focus on what should have been important to the community, what I felt was important to the community. So I saw so many law enforcement agencies across the country that got caught up in that. And I don't know if you saw recently, but there have been some of these training courses that have focused on training officers in drug interdiction and other types of things, and they got in trouble. New Jersey and was really where it first happened. There was a drug training company that they had video of them training the officers and telling them crazy things, telling them how to be violent and how to violate people's rights, and just completely insensitive to, I think the way that the public wants law enforcement officers to be. And, all of this came out after George Floyd, and we still have a lot of work to do, but there were some good strides that were made after George Floyd, but there's still a lot of change that needs to happen in law enforcement. I say it, and I've said it for at least 2 decades. I feel like American law enforcement lost its way, and I have huge respect, like you had, said, I have huge respect for law enforcement officers. There's a lot of really great people doing the job, but the leadership just lost its way. And like you said, it's a paramilitary organization. You have to follow orders. So even if you want to do the right thing, it's tough sometimes because you're not set up to do that.
Yeah. So let's talk about 70H. You do advocacy on it now too. So I'm going to defer to you to explain what it is and why you chose to use it and why you chose to become an advocate for people to have access to it. And really, I love your perspective because you're not a medical doctor, so it's not a medical perspective. It is a perspective on, whether or not someone thinks a person should be using 70H. The prohibition of it is not going to help anyone, and you've seen that with the prohibition of other drugs as an officer. And I remember when I first met you, I was thinking about this as you were talking. We met in 2019 at a conference, and you were pretty new to LEAP at that point. And I remember us having a conversation at the table when I met you, and you made a comment about, yeah, prohibition does not work on cannabis. It's, legally regulating this is the way to go. And then you said, maybe that's just true of other drugs too, or something like that. And it was just interesting to kind of like see that that evolution of your own thinking over time, very similar to my own, of just kind of, and so many other people's, of beginning to kind of put the pieces together and say, wait, the same principles that are at play on cannabis prohibition are at play in the prohibition of other drugs. And you have worked on counter-terrorism and transnational criminal organizations and national security and intelligence. And you haven't just worked in a local police department. So you've seen these things at the kind of global level too, which has only increased your belief that we've lost our way with prohibition. So let's talk about that and about 70H.
Well, thank you, Christina. Yeah, I realized I initially just thought that cannabis should be legal. I didn't think that harder drugs should, but LEAP really started to educate me on it. And then I started, and I had, like you said, I had worked a lot in Latin America. I'd worked on the other side of the war on drugs. I trained police officers in Latin America. I speak Spanish fluently, and spent a lot of time training police officers. I didn't do a lot of work specifically on drug enforcement. I worked a lot on leadership, on corruption, and that sort of thing. But I was side by side with other instructors who were teaching how, law enforcement officers in Latin America, how bad drugs were, and feeding them this whole American narrative, and we were funding a lot of these law enforcement officers too. We were giving them money. Our federal government was giving them money too. So they were taking the same focus that a lot of these local agencies that I was talking about. So once I really started understanding how prohibition had failed, I realized not only had prohibition failed, but it had done so much harm in Latin America. And, my parents were missionaries to Mexico, so I grew up in Mexico, and I remember what a safe country it was, 50 years ago, and how I, as a little, blonde white kid with blue eyes, I was, the only kid that even looked like me, and I drew so much attention walking the streets of, small towns where we lived. And my parents were perfectly safe with it. I could go out and go anywhere. And man, that has changed over the decades. Mexico is just not that country anymore. And a lot of my friends that live in Mexico, who are in law enforcement, and those who aren't, they don't let their kids play on the streets anymore. It's just not something that's done. And
because of the influence
the danger,
and power and danger of cartels, how much
cartels.
They have grown.
And everybody is just scared to death of the cartels. And so one of the things I did with LEAP was I really spearheaded an initiative to educate Latin American law enforcement officers on the failed war on drugs. So what I did was I did a lot of research. Not only did I have my own knowledge about the history of the war on drugs, but I did a lot of research about the war on drugs in Latin America and how it had just completely failed and has caused certain areas to be so dangerous and so much violence and corrupted politicians and corrupted police departments. And Mexico is a different country now. And, there's a famous saying in Mexico, Mexico's great, but unfortunately it's too far from God and too close to the United States of America. And if you think about that statement, I mean, that's a shame that a lot of Mexicans feel that way because of the demand for drugs coming from the United States, and the fact that there is neither country for many, many decades was interested in any kind of legal sort of avenue for those drugs to be available to to people in the United States, and it created all of this havoc. So I was really honored to be able to spend a lot of time in Latin America. And what was interesting is we got a better reception in Latin America than we did in the U.S. I created this workshop in English and tried to give it to American law enforcement officers to explain to them the history of the war on drugs and how it has transformed Latin America into this dangerous cesspool of crime and murder and people disappearing, and they weren't interested. But when we went to Latin America, we actually found I found a lot of police commanders and police chiefs who were like, well, we're still interested in drug enforcement, but we're frustrated. We don't know what to do. So sometimes they were willing to consider, maybe this is an option, finding another course of action as opposed to just strictly enforcement. But
right, it brings us to this interesting, because I feel like we have this moment in time that doesn't come around all the time, to have a new drug that has found a market very quickly, and we get a question mark. What are we going to do with it? Are we going to push it into the underground? Are we going to give it to the cartels to fight over, to murder people over, to make money from? Or are we going to allow it to be regulated and legal, and adults 21 and older can buy it? And so tell us your journey on 7-OH.
Sure. Well, I spent time in Iraq, and I actually ended up coming back from Iraq with a severe cervical injury. And it's one of the reasons I'd kind of started looking into cannabis at the time, because I was able to use it for controlling my pain. I got addicted to opiates right after I came back from Iraq, and getting off of that was really, really difficult and very painful and very miserable. And I said, I can't use that on a daily basis. So I started using cannabis. Worked well for me for a while, for quite a few years, but then I wasn't finding relief from it anymore the way that I had previously. And so someone told me about kratom. And so I started researching kratom, and then Jackie Subek, who is the director of Seven Hope Alliance, which, as you mentioned, I'm the law enforcement advisor for Seven Hope Alliance, she started talking to me about kratom, and specifically a derivative of kratom, which is 7-OH or 7-hydroxy. Well, kratom has been in the United States available and mostly legal throughout the United States for almost a couple of decades, and people have been using it for medicinal purposes. It never really created an issue for law enforcement. It's not like it was a party drug or anything like that, or like people were, going out to murder people for it or whatever, and pretty economical on the market too. So a couple of years ago, what they were able to do is they were able to create a derivative of it that didn't have some of the same side effects that kratom had. It was easier for your system to process, and it
Less
focused
plant
more.
material
Exactly, and it was
than
focused.
natural leaf kratom.
Yeah, it was focused more on pain relief, had more analgesic properties to it. And like you said, I'm not a doctor. Seven Hope Alliance does have a doctor on our staff, Michelle Ross, who is really amazing. I hope that your listeners get a
Yeah,
chance
we
to
just
look
interviewed
her up.
her.
Oh, you did? Okay, awesome. I knew that she had been in touch with you, but I wasn't sure if she had been on.
Yep.
But she's truly, truly amazing. And man, she knows a lot more about the science of this than I do. But ultimately, uh, Jackie said, "Why don't you try 7-hydroxy for your pain?" Because it's not something I wanted to take every day. It's just days when I have flare-ups. Literally, I'm in bed. I can't move when the pain gets really, really bad. And so I started researching 7-OH and found out that there was a lot of really good science behind it. There still needs to be a lot more research done. And during this process, I did end up taking 7-OH, and it was really amazing. It had an effect on me almost like the opioids did, almost like the pills, the painkillers, the narcotic painkillers that I had taken back when I came back from Iraq. It in some ways was working for me better, even better than cannabis. And so I really dove in and started researching it, and I ended up talking to a bunch of my friends in law enforcement because Jackie had asked me if I would be interested in telling my story and in supporting it publicly. And of course, I've spent my entire life protecting communities. I'm not going to get involved in promoting something that isn't going to be good for communities. It's going to go against my ethics and my morals, And I thought, well, it's right for me, but maybe it's not right for everybody. And so all of my law enforcement colleagues that I spoke to, most of them hadn't even heard of kratom or 7-OH. They had no idea about it. The ones that had heard of it said, well, we don't really have any issues with it. It's not like it's a party drug, or it's not like we get a lot of people getting in car crashes on it or whatever. And a couple of them told me, well, we who were familiar with it, they said, yeah, we started testing for it, but we haven't had any kind of spikes in, when we do blood tests for after accidents, drug-related accidents. And so I realized that it was relatively safe. It can be habit forming in some ways, can be addictive, and there can be issues with it, but we just haven't seen the numbers of deaths and incidents related to it. Kratom in general, which we call metragenine, as opposed to the 7-OH, which is what I'm talking about, which is the derivative. Metragenine has a lot more negative incidents, health incidents, and the federal government actually tracks those. And 7-OH has had very few, what they call adverse events, health events. And as far as I know to date, there's no actual death that is fully attributed to 7-OH, overdose death. There were polydrug users that were using some 7-OH, but they had other things in their system. And a lot of people are getting relief from it. And I see why. It's a lot of people with intestinal issues are using it. People with Crohn's disease and other things are using, other intestinal internal maladies are using it, and they're finding great relief from it. And we're just not having the negative events. And then I found out that it's being used by people who want to get off of opioids, and it's really helping people get off of other drugs, and specifically opioids that have been causing a lot of overdoses and deaths. And I realized that there's a huge potential here for us. Obviously, like I said, it needs more testing and more work, but there's a possibility that this could be what we've been looking for in the United States to really help with overdoses. So the numbers were astonishing to me. And in areas where 7-OH use went up, we were having reduced overdoses of certain opioids, and they don't have enough solid numbers yet to be able to directly connect that. But there's a lot of people working in that area that are saying that there's really a great likelihood that the availability of 7-OH has allowed a lot of people to get off of other drugs that are much more harmful.
Yeah, and I think as with 7-OH, as with all substances basically that we can ingest in our bodies, it can be harmful, which is true of pretty much everything. And I think the knee-jerk reaction that we have with a new drug, whatever we categorize as a new drug, is, wait a second, I heard that it could harden someone. It needs to be off the market. And we don't think about the fact that that's not how we deal with substances. Even what's FDA approved, it's not FDA approved because it's totally safe and has never harmed anyone. All you need to do is watch TV late at night, and you'll see all sorts of advertisements for pharmaceutical drugs that are FDA approved, and they got all kinds of terrible things that can happen to you. If you've got, and then they list off all of the complications that can happen. It can cause suicidal thoughts. It can get, just all kinds of stuff. Just because someone is taking something doesn't mean it's totally safe for everyone, and there's no potential for harm. That's true of 7-OH. It's true of everything that's on your, in the medicine cabinet at your house or at the store, whether it's prescription or not. You can hurt yourself. You can die from all sorts of different things. And that's just not the way that we approach other types of things that we ingest, except when it's a drug scare, because we have been conditioned to just be ready and afraid of a drug scare, whatever that is.
Yeah.
It's a new thing. Be afraid. Make it, ban it. So I'm going to play devil's advocate with you, Terry, and I'm going to say, let's say there were a bunch of people who had died. Let's say there was a bunch of people who were harmed. Let's say it had the potential for harm that opioids have, where, you take too much and it stops your, slows your respiratory system. We know that's true of opioids. The research is still being done on 7-OH. It appears to be much less true or not true that there's respiratory depression for people that are using it. So, but let's say that, let's say even the worst predictions about 7-OH were true. You and I still don't believe that that's a reason to ban it, because prohibition ends up increasing the harm. It pushes it into the underground market. Now we're funding cartels. Now we're giving it to people who are going to stick fentanyl in it and then sell it to someone. If you thought 7-OH was dangerous on a legal market, just wait till it gets to the underground market where, nothing is going to be off limits that you could add to it. To talk about that side, because I think for a lot of people, for pain patients, they're thinking of it only in the proactive side. Hey, this could be helpful to someone. But there's people listening who are going to say, I don't care if it could be helpful to someone. The fact that it could be harmful to someone is enough for me to say, hey, let's just ban it. This is going to be too risky. Talk through that from your perspective and from your experience of why you have moved away from that response of let's just ban it if it can be helpful, or if it could be harmful. Why does it just not work to do that?
Well, one of the things that we found from the war on drugs is that, like you said, prohibition just doesn't work. Prohibition, completely banning something, just drives it underground. Ultimately, driving it underground puts it in the hand of irresponsible companies or individuals that produce it. Producers is the word that I'm looking for. And I can tell you that right now, I have met a lot of the owners and principals in companies, 7-OH companies, and they are all very dedicated to keeping it out of the hands of children, out of the hands of people that are under 21, to responsible packaging, child-proof packaging, warning labels. It's actually, I've been really impressed with what a good job that they've done. Most of these companies are very responsible producers, responsible actors. And I can tell you that if it went underground, same people wouldn't be in the business. They're not just going to say, okay, well, fine, we'll go underground, we'll still produce it. I asked some of them directly that. If it was banned completely, would you go underground? Absolutely not. We're not going to do that because we're, good, upstanding, law-abiding people. And so you have the wrong people making it, the wrong people trafficking it. You don't have the protections. You don't have the warning labels, and you're creating this complete underground economy that is full of criminals, basically people that don't care who gets hurt. And one of the things that we saw in cannabis was that when cannabis started becoming legal, we saw a huge drop in violence that was related to cannabis trafficking. Because, if you go into a dispensary and you buy some cannabis, let's say that you put it on a credit card or something, and then you didn't pay your credit card bill, the credit card company isn't going to send somebody out to break your knees or to stab you, but when you have illegal dealers out on the street that are trying to control their territory, and we know for a fact, I particularly, but other people even smarter than me have studied what prohibition can do in communities, how it raises up entire illegal, illicit economies of people who end up fighting for territory and using violence to control those territories. It absolutely does not work. And so there has to be, one of the things that's happening right now is there's a push to schedule 7-OH with the federal government. And that is not the way to go, because it means that we won't be able to do research on it. It absolutely will go underground. And we need more research. We need to find ways to make it legally available to the people who need it, like me. I use it legally right now, but if it's banned, I'm not going to use it illegally. And then that would be, I would have to go back to looking for something that helps me with my pain. And I've looked for a long time. I haven't found anything that works like 7-OH does. So banning it completely is not, and there's so many smart people out there that understand prohibition and how prohibition really harms communities. And I can tell you that I've seen it with my own two eyes as a street cop, as a law enforcement advisor working in Latin America, seeing how pushing it underground just creates so much crime that's associated with it. Banning it is not the answer. It absolutely is not the answer. And we need to think about these fentanyl deaths. I mean, fentanyl deaths have dropped drastically within the last couple of years. And like I said before, one of the things that we believe has had an impact on that is the availability of 7-OH. And we don't want to stop that progress. I mean, everybody knows how horrible the number of fentanyl deaths have been in the United States, and how they've affected especially certain communities that were just plagued with it. And a lot of those communities have seen a rise in the use of 7-OH and a decrease in fentanyl deaths. So we need a way to be able to to market it and to make it available to people that it can really help.
And there are a lot of people for whom going to the doctor all the time to get a prescription and then paying the cost of that prescription is out of reach. They don't have transportation to do that. They can't get to the doctor at a particular time. Maybe they don't have a job where they can take off at 3 in the afternoon to go to their doctor's appointment because they're working shift hours or whatever. And they've got chronic pain. That was an interesting thing that I really saw during this last legislative session in Mississippi while we were working on like natural leaf kratom, was just how many of the people who would send me their stories were working in physical labor jobs. And I don't work in a physical labor job. I sit in an office or I go and, speak somewhere or something like that. I do not know what it is like to use my body for work every day. Like that is how I provide for my family. Nor do I know what that does to my body, the toll that that takes. But for a lot of people who are working their bodies to provide for their family, that takes a huge toll, but they also tend to be people who have less access to healthcare. Maybe they're living in rural areas, they're doing factory work, maybe they're doing other types of physical work. So it's this interesting thing because the people who tend to have the power to make the choices tend to be people who are not working with their bodies in physical labor. And yet they're making the choices about who has access to what to treat their pain. So you've got all of these people who need options. They don't have the health insurance. They don't have the access to going to the doctor all the time, to paying for prescriptions all of the time. And with the crackdown on opioids, you've got to go to the doctor even more often to keep getting your opioids with the crackdowns that have happened. And so there are so many people out there who are dealing with chronic pain, who are often living paycheck to paycheck, working with their bodies to provide for their family. And we keep taking away options for them. We keep saying, no, you can't use that. No, you can't use that. You got to have a prescription. You got to go to the doctor. You got to do this. You got to do that. And what we saw is when we cut back on prescriptions over the last 10, 20 years, the rate of death went dramatically up. Fentanyl hit the underground market at the same time that we were cutting people off of the legal market for pain management prescriptions, what we had at the time. 7-OH is pretty new, so that was not available over the last 20 years. And we saw a bunch of people migrating to the underground market. And what are they getting there? They're getting who knows what, somebody pressed in a pill at a fake pill mill and they're dying from an overdose because they can't correctly dose what they're getting. There is, the more people that I meet, the more strongly that I feel we have to open some opportunities for people to be able to get something to manage pain that is not a prescription. I'm not against prescriptions, as a whole, nor are we as an organization. But when we come across something like 7-OH that we still need to do a lot of research, but certainly doesn't have the kind of risk that something like fentanyl does, or a high potency opioid that we know has significant respiratory depression that's going to happen, which is what ends up kind of causing an overdose.
Exactly, and which 7-OH, by the way, does not cause that same respiratory depression.
Yeah, so here's an option. It may have some risks, absolutely. We both agree that it does. And yet, have we found something that could be another tool, a tool that's less harmful than people using underground street drugs, a tool that's less harmful than whatever they might come up with otherwise to try to get through the day, and more affordable, and something they can actually access? I live in Mississippi. We are an incredibly rural state. We have all sorts of healthcare deserts. We have some telehealth. Some people can access that and some people can't. But when we have so many people who are living and working just to put food on their table, and the way that they're doing that is getting up and working hours and hours at physical labor jobs, even into their 40s, 50s, 60s. We got to reckon with that. That is just part of caring for our society. It takes a lot of pride to say no. You've got to only access pain management in the way that somebody with an office job might access pain management. And even for you, who also has an office job, it doesn't always work. It's not always beneficial. You didn't want to be on opioids. They were harming your life. They were not improving your health. You needed another option. So There are so many reasons why is my main point as I get on my soapbox. I will get off my soapbox. There are so many reasons why prohibition is not helpful. It's not helpful because it doesn't work and it creates all kinds of harm in the communities that are now going to be harmed by crime and violence. It doesn't work because it's going to be contaminated. People are still going to sell it. It's just going to be the wrong people selling it. There's no ability to regulate those sellers. And it doesn't work because there is a large group of people in the world who are struggling with chronic pain. And they have been suffering as more and more tools have been taken away from them. We need to be looking for options for them that can help them to have tools to be able to manage that pain, to be able to provide for themselves and their families. It's part of how we allow people that autonomy to do the things we want them to do, which is get out there and work and provide and live your life and be a contributing member to society. And yet we're unwilling to give them what for many people has been a tool that has allowed them to do that. If you could have your magic wand and make something happen with 7-OH, what do you think is kind of the next best steps for us with something that is new? It's been around for about 2 years as a consumer product. What would you like to see happen with it?
Well, first of all, we need to stop the bans. More and more states have come out and made it illegal. Like I said, the federal government, parts of the federal government have tried to push to get it scheduled. We need to stop all of that. We need more research directly on the drug to understand more about it. We need better research on how it's being used in the communities and the impact that it's having, and if there are adverse effects. We've got pretty good numbers now, but we need better tracking of that so that we can understand exactly what the potential for this drug is and what the potential negative impacts could be on our communities. And we just don't have any of that yet. We're just doing this too soon. We're jumping the gun, and we're trying to ban something that really should not be banned yet. And if it gets scheduled like cannabis, remember how we were never able to do research on cannabis to truly understand the benefits of cannabis, and put us decades behind in really providing cannabis for people that needed it for medicinal purposes. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen with kratom. And I can tell you that at some point, if we ban all kratom or 7-OH, I can tell you at some point in the future, we're going to have to come back to it. We're going to have to revisit it, because the evidence, there's too much evidence out there that really makes us think that 7-OH could be this miracle drug, this miracle substance that helps people, reduce pain, and that also basically helps with the drug addiction, and with fentanyl addiction and fentanyl deaths. So we're going to have to revisit it, and I just don't want to see this. Who knows if I'll even be around for it, but I don't want to see this same stupid cycle that happened with cannabis over decades, where we just got decades behind on providing it to people that needed it, people that really, and I think 7-OH is even more miraculous than cannabis. I believe that with all of my heart, especially now that I know as much as I know about it and having used it myself. Just real quickly, I had the most painful, the longest root canal that I've ever had a few weeks ago, and the doctor offered me opiates, and I said, sorry doc, I can't use opiates. So I used the 7-OH, and it was absolutely miraculous. The way that it controlled my pain and just made it a much less miserable experience was amazing. And if I wasn't already an advocate and a believer in it because of my cervical pain, after that I was like, wow, the dentists should be handing this out, to their patients, instead of opiates.
Thank you so much, Terry. Always great to talk with you. Always great
You
to
as
get
well, Christina.
your thoughts from multiple angles on this particular topic. So really appreciate you. Invite people to go ahead and subscribe to our podcast. and subscribe to the newsletter. And then you can have conversations like me and Terry are having with, he reads something and sends me a response about it, and here we are chatting about it on the podcast. So I love hearing from people. If you're listening and have questions, send them in. You can always email curious@enditforgood.com. That's the place where we gather all sorts of things, including requests for books and all kinds of things. So join us there, and we would love to see you back here for our next episode. And in the meantime, encourage you to keep learning, keep listening, keep thinking critically about what you're hearing, and do not give in to the fear of when somebody tries to get you just to be afraid, because when we're afraid, we stop thinking, we stop reasoning, we cannot learn. That's how the human mind works. So shift away from fear and think critically about how can we reduce harm from a substance without creating more harm. And to Terry's point, being 50 years down the road again and saying, wait a second, there might be something here that is potentially helpful for people. Or, you know what, we didn't have to give 7-OH to the cartels to fight over and to increase their revenues. That's the choice that's before us. So whether or not you think it is a healthy thing, we've got to grapple with what would be the cost, what would be the price we would pay if we push this underground. It will be a heavy price. So thank you, Terry, for joining us. It's been fun to have you.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you next time on the End It for Good podcast. So how do we shift our drug policies from a criminal justice approach to a public health approach? By inviting one person at a time to change their mind. Changed minds are the catalyst to changed laws. But many people are only willing to have this conversation when they're invited to by someone that they trust. That's you. Invite your friends, coworkers, other people in your circle of influence to consider a better way. At End It for Good, our hope is that people who hear will become people who tell. Start a conversation and join the movement to end it for good.